Ferrari didn't waste much time after the summer break. A new floor is heading to Zandvoort for the SF26, and the detail that stands out is timing. This particular version wasn't on the development sheet a few weeks ago. Something in the data from Austria and Silverstone pushed Ferrari to move faster than planned, getting the parts into production before the mandatory factory shutdown even began. Teams don't usually rush a component through manufacturing during their one enforced break of the year unless they think it matters. So what do we actually know here, and what are we just assuming? We know Ferrari is bringing an evolution of the floor it introduced in Barcelona back in June, that this specific update was reportedly brought forward after a review of Austrian and Silverstone data. What we don't know yet is whether that acceleration reflects a real weakness Ferrari felt it had to correct, or whether it's simply the next scheduled step in a development program that was always going to evolve this way, just arriving a little earlier than expected. Those two explanations aren't mutually exclusive, and by the end of this weekend we should have a better sense of which one fits. This isn't a new concept, it's a further development of the Barcelona floor, a package that also brought changes to the diffuser, the side pods, and the front wing when it first appeared. The Zandvoort version builds on that same direction rather than replacing it, which tells you Ferrari still believes the underlying philosophy is sound. They're refining an idea, not abandoning one. The floor matters more than almost any other part on a current generation F1 car because it's where most of the downforce comes from. Ride height, how the floor edge seals against the airflow, and how effectively the diffuser extracts air from underneath all work together. And that relationship has to hold up as the car pitches and rolls through a lap. Get the balance right and the car is stable at high speed and predictable on entry. Get it wrong and the platform becomes inconsistent. Strong in some conditions, nervous in others. Without an obvious pattern the drivers can work around. What Ferrari is chasing, based on what's been reported, is more load without the drag penalty that usually comes with it. That's the perpetual trade-off with floor development. Making more downforce is the easy part. Making more downforce that doesn't cost you on the straights is the actual challenge, and it's presumably what's occupied Ferrari's aero department since Barcelona. The bigger ambition seems to go beyond a single number too. Ferrari wants the SF26 to stop being a car that only looks strong on power circuits with long straights and start being competitive on tighter, more technical layouts, where sustained cornering load matters more than outright speed. Austria, by most accounts, is where that limitation showed up most clearly. The SF26 didn't match the level it had shown 2 weeks earlier in Barcelona, partly down to setup, but apparently enough to prompt Ferrari to bring this floor forward rather than wait for its next planned window. The figures circulating suggest something in the region of 0.2 a lap. That's not an official Ferrari number, and it's worth treating it accordingly. Estimates like this usually come from simulation and CFD work, and simulation tools are good but imperfect. Track temperature, wind, tyre behaviour, and real-world correlation all introduce variables a wind tunnel can't fully anticipate. 0.2 sounds modest on its own, but the value of that number depends entirely on how tightly the competitive order is packed this weekend. In a close midfield fight, 0.2 can be the gap between rows on the grid. In a season where Mercedes has built a bigger cushion, it might barely register. We'll get a much better read on what it actually means once Ferrari's real pace is compared against its rivals rather than its own internal targets. Zandvoort isn't just the next stop on the calendar. For a floor development like this, it's close to a worst-case test, which is exactly what makes it revealing. The track is short, just over 4.2 kilometres with 14 corners, but the difficulty isn't the layout, it's the two banked corners, turn 3 and turn 14 at roughly 19 and 18 degrees. That banking changes how load moves through the tyre in a way almost no other circuit replicates. It's not purely lateral force anymore, there's a vertical component too, and that affects tyre temperature and carcass loading in ways that are hard to predict from data gathered anywhere else. For a floor this sensitive to ride height, that's a real examination. Any shift in how the floor is sealing against the ground, any change in aero balance gets amplified through those sections. Then there's the wind. Zandvoort's proximity to the North Sea means wind direction and strength can shift meaningfully within a single weekend, which is a problem for a car that leans heavily on aerodynamic balance. A gust hitting the floor or the rear wing differently can alter the front to rear balance without the driver changing anything. Sand blown in from the dunes adds another layer, settling on the racing line and changing the available grip session to session. None of that is unique to this floor, but it does mean engineers will have to work out how much of any lap time shift is the car and how much is just the track being a slightly different track 3 hours later. And this is a sprint weekend, which cuts practice down to a single hour before anything competitive begins. That's a narrow window to confirm whether a new part is behaving the way the simulations predicted, especially somewhere this sensitive to setup. A strong session doesn't necessarily prove the floor is transformational. With so little track time, setup choices carry more weight than usual, so a good result could partly reflect Ferrari getting the car right rather than the floor doing all the work on its own. Equally, a difficult session wouldn't automatically mean the floor has underperformed. It could just as easily be wind, changing conditions, or a compromise forced by the lack of running. Correlation between simulation and reality always needs confirming on track, and one chaotic sprint weekend is not the cleanest environment to do that. Pirelli is bringing the same C2, C3 and C4 selection as last year, and the point worth making here is a simple one. A floor can't really be judged on qualifying pace alone. More load sounds like an unambiguous positive, but if it comes with extra stress on the tyre over a stint, the benefit can shrink or disappear by the time the race is 20 laps old. Ferrari will need the new floor to hold up over a run, not just on a single flying lap, for this update to mean much in race trim. Whatever happens in Zandvoort, this floor is the opening step of a longer sequence rather than the finished article. The next piece arrives at Monza, where Ferrari is expected to introduce an upgraded power unit through what's been described as the second ADUO window, built around a larger diameter turbo aimed at improving straight-line performance. Reports point to somewhere around 13 to 15 additional horsepower, though Ferrari hasn't confirmed that figure either, and it's best treated the same way as the floor's lap time estimate. Plausible, unconfirmed, worth revisiting once it's actually running. It's also worth being upfront about what these upgrades aren't going to do. Neither the floor nor the Monza engine closes the structural gap to Mercedes HPP or Red Bull powertrains on the power unit side. That's tied to the current engine architecture, and any real correction realistically waits for the 2027 regulations. What Ferrari appears to be targeting for the rest of this season is more modest. Enough combined gain from the aero and power sides to build a genuinely competitive car against Mercedes, rather than a single upgrade that closes the gap outright. Zandvoort won't give us a clean laboratory test. Wind, sand, a single hour of practice and a sprint format all get in the way of a tidy before and after comparison, but it can still offer useful evidence, provided you know where to look. Minimum speed through turns 3 and 14 will tell you more about whether this floor is doing its job than the overall lap delta will. That's where the banking pushes the floor hardest. Consistency across different runs and different wind conditions matters just as much. A car that's fast for one lap and nervous the next hasn't necessarily solved anything. Tyre behaviour over longer runs is worth watching alongside single lap pace, given the point about load versus degradation. And it's worth paying attention to whether Ferrari's operating window, the range of conditions where the car actually performs, looks wider than it did in Austria, rather than fixating on where it qualifies relative to Mercedes on a single Saturday. If Ferrari can make this floor work consistently across a circuit as variable and demanding as Zandvoort, that's a meaningful signal that the development direction is sound. It won't tell us the SF26's underlying weaknesses are fixed, and it won't tell us Ferrari has closed the gap to Mercedes. But it would be a genuinely useful data point heading into the rest of the season, considerably more useful than any lap time estimate we've heard so far, official or otherwise.